Montana Territory, October 1882. The wind cut sharp across the Livingston train platform, tugging at coats and scattering yellowed leaves like old secrets. Della Barnett stood frozen near the edge, her gloved hand pressed tight over her mouth, shoulders trembling as the last train whistle faded into the mountains. Tears slid down her cheeks, fast and silent, the kind that had been waiting too long to fall. She held a carpetbag so tightly her knuckles were white. Her father had died last week. The telegram came fast, the funeral faster. She had buried him alone, the last family she had. Now her return ticket to Chicago sat crumpled in her hand, useless. There was no one waiting for her anymore, no job, no home. The wind picked up, she could barely stay upright. "Ma'am," the voice was quiet but steady like the calm before a summer storm. She turned, blinking through tears. A tall man stood a few feet away, hat in hand. His coat was dusted with trail dirt, his boots cracked and worn. His eyes were a deep kind of brown, steady and sure like the earth itself. "My name's Judson Fairbanks," he said, stepping closer. "You all right, miss?" She shook her head once. "No," the word broke something inside her. She bent over, sobbing again, bent by grief and cold and the weight of everything that had gone wrong. He did not speak at first, just stepped beside her and held out his hand, not asking, not rushing, just offering. She stared at it, rough palm, calloused fingers. A working man's hand. "Come sit down," he said. "You look like you have not had a warm fire or a kind word in days." She let him lead her to the bench. "My name is Della Barnett," she said when her breath came back. He nodded. "You from Chicago?" "Not anymore." He glanced down the tracks. "Train is gone for the day. You have somewhere to stay tonight." She looked up at him, eyes red-rimmed. "No," he nodded like he had expected that. "I have a place just outside town, my sister's old cabin. She married and moved to Idaho 2 years ago. It is warm, clean. You can stay there until you decide what comes next." "You do not even know me," she whispered. "I know what it feels like to be alone when you should not be," he answered. Della hesitated, then nodded. He carried her bag without asking, walking beside her in silence. She noticed then that he limped slightly, favoring his left leg. They reached a buckboard wagon parked behind the depot. He helped her up, then climbed in and took the reins. "Lost your horse?" she asked. "No," he said. "Sold him last week. Supplies run short come winter." She looked at his coat again, the threadbare edges, the way he seemed to keep his own pain tucked quiet behind his eyes. The ride was quiet, just the rattle of wheels and the far-off cry of coyotes. The cabin sat near a frozen creek, tucked between cottonwoods turned gold. He helped her down, unlocked the door, and stepped aside to let her in first. Inside was simple but warm. A stone hearth, 2 wooden chairs, a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a pot of stew already simmered on the stove. "You live here?" she asked. He shook his head. "I stay in the barn out back. This was my sister's home. She left it to me when she married. I keep it ready for travelers or neighbors needing shelter." She turned to him with wide eyes. "You mean you are giving me the house and you are sleeping in the barn?" "I have done worse," he said with a shrug. Her lip trembled. "Judson, I do not know what to say." "You do not need to say anything," he said. "Eat, rest. Tomorrow will come and you will figure out from there." She stepped forward, sudden and unthinking, and hugged him, tight. He froze for a second, then wrapped his arms around her gently. No promises, no questions, just warmth. Later, after she had eaten and changed into one of his sister's old nightgowns, Della sat near the fire, staring into the flames. Judson knocked once before stepping in with extra firewood. He paused when he saw her curled in the chair under the quilt, her eyes soft now, her face worn but no longer crumpled. "I hope it is all right I stayed up," she said. He nodded. "I do not sleep much." "Was it the war?" she asked quietly. He stared at the fire a long moment. "Yes." She stood, walked over, and took a log from his arms to place in the hearth. Their hands brushed. "I lost my brother at Shiloh," she said, "and now my father, I have no one left." "You do now," he said softly. She looked up at him. "You mean that?" He nodded once. The silence between them settled into something warm. Della reached out and took his hand, his rough, weathered hand. She held it tight. And this time she did not cry. The morning crept in quiet, pale light slipping through the chinks in the shutters. Della stirred beneath the quilt, blinking at the unfamiliar ceiling. The scent of ash and pine lingered in the air, mingling with something warm, coffee maybe. Her feet touched the floorboards, cool and smooth, and she stood slowly, listening. A kettle hissed gently on the stovetop. Judson was outside. She stepped into her boots, laced them tight, and pulled on the wool shawl she'd found folded at the foot of the bed. The cabin's door creaked as she opened it, and the cold met her like a breath held too long. Judson stood by the creek, his back to her, cutting lengths of firewood with a steady rhythm. His coat was off, sleeves rolled to the elbow. There were scars along his forearm, long, pale lines that looked old but deep. She didn't speak right away. When he finally turned, he looked surprised to see her there. "You sleep all right?" he asked, setting the axe aside. "Well enough," she said, stepping down the porch stairs. "You start your days early." "Livestock don't wait," he said with a faint shrug, wiping his hands on a rag. "I fed the hens already. There's bread in the warming pan if you're hungry." She hesitated, running her hand along the porch rail. "Do you always do this alone?" "I'm not much for town," he said. "Folks there are friendly enough, but I reckon I fit better out here." She nodded, eyes following the curve of the creek. "I used to think I wanted city life, but I don't know anymore." Judson leaned against the porch post, watching her. "What did you do in Chicago?" "I taught reading and piano in a boarding school for girls," she said slowly. "It was decent work, quiet, but I was always waiting for something else to begin." "You play?" he asked. "Not anymore," she said. "The piano was sold last spring when enrollment dipped. I haven't touched one since." He didn't press her, just looked toward the barn. "I've got a fiddle tucked away, belonged to my uncle. I don't play, but if you'd like something to practice on, you're welcome to it." She blinked at him. "I wouldn't want to damage it." "I wouldn't offer it if I thought you would," he said. Della folded her arms, half against the wind, half from something else stirring inside her. "Why are you being so kind to me?" He met her eyes. "Because you needed someone to be." She looked away, throat tightening. After a moment she asked, "What do you do for work?" "Leather mostly," he said. "Harness repairs, saddle work, the odd pair of boots if someone's desperate. I trap some in the winter." "Not much, but it keeps me eating. You built this place up yourself." "The frame was here when my sister moved in. I helped finish it. Took most of a summer." He glanced at the logs he'd been splitting. "Hard work's never bothered me." She stepped toward him, her boots crunching softly in the frost. "You said last night you don't sleep much." He nodded once. "Do you ever talk about it?" "No," he said. "Not unless someone's real quiet and real patient." She didn't answer. Just reached down, picked up a split log and carried it to the porch stack beside him. He didn't stop her. By noon, she'd swept the cabin, boiled water for washing, and stitched a tier in one of the curtains. Judson had gone into town with a small load of pelts. She stayed behind, content to move in the hush of the place, her hands busy. When he returned, he brought flour, lamp oil, and a paper-wrapped ham hock. He placed it on the table without comment. "You barter for this?" she asked, tying her apron tighter. He nodded. "Trapper's Supply shop near the livery. They know me." That evening, after supper, she stood by the window while he sat at the table, oiling the handle of an old hunting knife. "I don't know what comes next," she said without turning. "You don't have to yet," he replied, eyes on the blade. "I can't stay forever." "No," he admitted, "but maybe long enough to rest." She turned then, her face caught in the low firelight. "You don't talk much, Judson." He looked up. "I've found listening gets me further." She pulled a chair beside his slowly and sat. "Then maybe I'll talk," she said, and he just nodded, setting the knife aside. By the fourth day, the ground had hardened under a thin crust of snow. The sky hung low, pale as bone, and the trees along the creek stood bare, their branches crackling in the cold. Della stepped outside just after dawn, pulling her shawl tighter, and followed the narrow path Judson had worn between the barn and the house. Inside, he was kneeling beside the wood stove. coaxing flame from kindling with a slow patience. She watched him for a moment before speaking. "I cleaned out the root cellar," she said. There was a basket of apples starting to go soft at the bottom. He sat back on his heels, wiping soot from his fingers. "You think they'll keep until next week?" "Not likely." "I was thinking of baking a pie." He stood, brushing his hands on his trousers. "Haven't had pie since last winter, might forget how to eat it proper." She smiled faintly. "I doubt that." He reached for the kettle. "I was planning to ride north tomorrow. There's an old veteran out near Pine Creek, Elias Moore. He's been trading me elk hide for stitching work. Said he's got one ready." She leaned against the doorway, her boots leaving damp marks on the packed earth floor. "Would you want company?" He poured water into a tin basin. "It's near a day's ride there and back. Snow's light now, but the wind along the ridge can press hard. I'm not asking to be coddled." She stepped deeper into the barn, brushing stray straw from a hanging bridle. "I've ridden before." "I'm not helpless, Judson." He studied her face, then gave a slow nod. "If you saddle that mare in the pen, you can come. I'll get her ready after breakfast." They left before first light the next morning, bundled in wool and fur. Della rode slightly behind, her mare stepping carefully along the frost-hardened trail. Judson led the way, his shoulders hunched against the wind, hat pulled low. They didn't speak much, the hush of the woods wrapping around them like a quilt. As they neared the ridge, Della's fingers numbed even inside her gloves. She pressed them beneath her coat, watching Judson's back. At the crest, he pulled up his horse and pointed toward a crooked line of smoke in the distance. "That's Elias's place. We'll be there before midday." They reached the cabin by noon. Elias, wiry and windburned, greeted Judson with a clasp of hands and a nod to Della. He had a thick hide stretched across a frame beneath a canvas tarp, and the three of them spent a quiet hour rolling it tight and tying it down behind Judson's saddle. Afterward, Elias handed Della a cup of boiled coffee and motioned toward the bench outside his cabin. "You ride well," he said. "Don't see many women on this trail." "I wouldn't have come if I hadn't been invited," he chuckled, low and rough. "You two kin?" "No," she said, then paused. "But I'm staying in the cabin near the creek. For now." Elias glanced toward Judson, who was tightening his saddle straps. "He don't talk about much, but he's solid. Pulled me out of a gulch last winter when my leg gave out." Della watched Judson for a long moment. "He doesn't say much about himself." "Doesn't need to," Elias said. "You watch him and you'll know more than if he told you." They rode back with the wind at their backs. The sun hung low by the time they reached the edge of Judson's land. Della's legs ached, but she didn't complain. Inside the cabin, after the horses were fed and the hide stored, she set to work slicing apples while Judson lit the oil lamp. The light cast long shadows across the table as she sprinkled cinnamon and folded the dough. "You always this good in a kitchen?" he asked, watching her hands. "I had to be," she said. "My father never learned to cook anything that didn't come from a tin." He leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "You miss him?" "I don't know," she said after a moment. "He was stern, always working. But I think he meant well in the only way he knew how." Judson didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Sometimes the ones that leave us didn't know how to stay." She met his eyes. "Did yours?" He didn't look away. "No." The silence stretched, warm and close like the air before thunder. Della reached for the pie tin and slid it into the stove. "You never married?" "No," he said. "The war took most of that away. I came back and didn't fit nowhere." She knelt by the stove, adjusting the coals. "You fit here." He watched her, his voice quiet. "I do now." She stood slowly and faced him. "I don't know what I'm doing, Judson. I don't know what comes next." "You don't have to," he said. "Just stay until it makes sense." She stepped toward him, her hands still dusted with flour. "And if it does, then I'll be right here." He didn't move, but she could feel the heat coming off him, steady as the stove behind her. She reached up and touched his face lightly, like testing the edge of something fragile. He closed his eyes, just for a second. Then he opened them and he kissed her. Simple, certain, like he'd been waiting for her to give him permission. She kissed him back, her hands at the edge of his collar, not pulling him closer, just holding him there. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his chest. "I don't want to be afraid anymore." "You won't be," he said. "Not with me." And she believed him. The pie had long since cooled, half of it eaten between them by lamplight. Della had fallen asleep in the chair, her hands tucked beneath her cheek, the quilt from the bed draped over her shoulders. Judson watched her from across the room, his body still, his thoughts less so. For years, he'd moved through his days with a kind of resigned quiet, content with the rhythm of his work and the solitude of the land. He hadn't expected anything that stirred the still water inside him. But now, sitting in his sister's old rocker, the fire low and her breath soft in the hush, he didn't feel the weight of solitude anymore. The next morning dawned brittle and gray. A heavy frost coated the porch railings, and the air held the sharp edge of coming snow. Della was already at the stove when Judson came in from checking the stock, sleeves rolled and apron tied. She was humming under her breath, something slow and tuneless that he didn't recognize. He leaned against the doorframe, brushing ice from his collar. "You always hum when you cook," she didn't turn. "Only when my hands know what they're doing." He crossed the room and set a small bundle of eggs in the basin. "You said you taught piano." "Did you ever write music?" "I tried," she said, flicking a lock of hair from her brow. "But it never came out right. I'd start something, then leave it half-finished. I suppose I was waiting for the rest of it to make sense." He dried his hands on a cloth. "You think it might now?" She looked over her shoulder. "Maybe." They ate by the window, steam rising from their bowls. The sky outside was thick with cloud, the kind that didn't bother with thunder, just pressed down until snow began to fall without warning. Judson tipped his bowl forward. "Storm's coming in by tonight. I'll need to bring the goats into the barn loft." "I can help," she said, already rising. He shook his head. "Not with that shoulder. I saw you rubbing it yesterday." She froze, surprised. "You notice everything, only what matters." She sat slowly. "It's an old injury. I fell off a ladder years back. It aches in the cold." He nodded once, then stood. "Rest it. I'll take care of the animals." She watched him go, the door clicking shut behind him, then turned back to the window. The snow had started, fine and steady. Somewhere deep in the trees, a crow called out once and then was silent. By late afternoon, the wind had picked up. Della brought in kindling and double-checked the seams of the windows for drafts. When Judson returned, his coat was stiff with ice, his cheeks red from the wind. He set down his gloves, unwrapped a parcel from his coat pocket and handed it to her. She opened it slowly. Inside was a folded sheet of music paper, blank, save for the clean lines waiting to be filled. She looked up at him. "There's a writing board and charcoal in the drawer," he said. "If you want to try again," her throat tightened. "Why would you think of this?" "Because you stopped humming once the snow started." She blinked, then nodded, unable to speak just yet. They spent the evening near the fire, him carving strips of rawhide for a repair order, her bent over the writing board, lips pressed tight as she began to sketch out notes. The cabin was quiet except for the shifting of wood in the hearth and the slow scratch of charcoal against paper. When the wind howled loud against the shutters, she looked up. "Were you ever afraid?" she asked. Judson didn't glance up from his work. "Plenty. But you keep going." He paused, setting down the strip of leather. "Fear's not the same as weakness. I learned that too late." She tilted her head. "And now, I know what matters. I know when to hold on." She set the board aside and crossed the room, kneeling beside his chair. "Then hold on to me." He touched her face, slow and careful, as if learning each line fresh. "I already am." She leaned into his hand, eyes closed, and the wind outside faded into the hush between them. For the first time in years, she felt safe. Not sheltered from the world, but strong enough to meet it with him. Night settled deep, and the snow kept falling, soft as breath. The storm lasted 2 full days. Snow drifted high along the cabin walls, and the creek froze solid by the second morning. Judson kept the hearth fed and the animals sheltered while Della stayed indoors. her time split between the fiddle and the unfinished music that now lived in soft pencil strokes across a growing stack of paper. By the third morning, the sky cleared, pale blue and cold enough to sting. Judson stepped out with a pail to break ice from the trough, and when he returned, Della was waiting with a fresh wool coat folded over her arm. "You never wear anything heavier than that canvas one," she said. "I found this wrapped in linen at the bottom of a trunk." "It was your sister's, wasn't it?" He shook his head. "Belonged to her husband, left it behind when they moved," she held it out. "It's thick and stitched strong, you should wear it while you work." He took it slowly, his fingers brushing hers. "You've made this place warmer than I ever managed on my own." She reached for the kettle. "I've been thinking about staying." He didn't move. "I don't mean for a few more days," she continued. "I mean if you'd have me here, for good." He stepped forward, voice quiet. "This land's never been much without someone to share it." She looked up from the stove. "Then maybe we stop waiting for something better and make do with what's already good." Judson stood still a moment longer, then reached for her hand. "You'd be my wife," her eyes shone, not with surprise but with a kind of peace that had settled deep. "Yes, Judson, if you'll ask me." He kissed her then, not tentative but rooted, as sure as the trees outside. When they pulled apart, he rested his forehead to hers. "I'll build you a proper table," he said, "with a place carved for your music sheets. And I'll plant us a garden come spring," she whispered. That afternoon they rode into town. The sky was clear and the snow along the trail sparkled under the sun. At the general store, Della chose calico for a dress and a spool of blue thread. Judson traded a bundle of cured hide for a pair of new work gloves and a tin of lamp polish. They stopped by the preacher's small home before heading back. He answered the door with a smile, squinting in the winter light. "You two come about Sunday service," Judson cleared his throat. "We're here to be married, sir, if you've a mind to do it." The preacher's eyes softened. "I'd be honored. Tomorrow at midday," Della nodded. "That's soon enough." The next morning, beneath a bare-limbed cottonwood, with snow crunching faintly underfoot and the preacher's wife holding a leather-bound Bible, they spoke their vows. Judson's hand trembled just once as he placed a simple gold ring on Della's finger, but his voice never faltered when he promised her a steady life, and a place she'd never need to leave. Della's reply was quiet but certain. "I'll build beside you and I'll never walk away." They kissed under the open sky, breath mingling in the cold, and when they rode home, they did so side by side, not speaking, not needing to. Winter passed with long evenings by the fire and slow mornings thick with frost. Judson carved the table he'd promised, and Della filled it with pages of music. She played the fiddle often not with performance in mind, but in moments when the light changed just so, or when Judson sat near and listened with his eyes closed. They built a henhouse together in early March. He held the beams while she hammered, and when she laughed at a crooked nail, he kissed the top of her head and called it the finest coop in the territory. When the thaw came, Judson cleared a patch of land beside the porch. Della planted peas and carrots first, then added sage and lavender near the steps. The wind no longer howled quite so harshly at night, and the cabin, once silent and spare, filled with the soft clutter of two lives joined. The fiddle stayed by the hearth. Her sheet music grew into a full composition by early April. She named it Creek Bend Waltz, after the place where her life had turned. By summer, Judson had added a porch swing. On warm evenings they sat close, her head against his shoulder, and watched the sun slip behind the ridge, the sky soft with dusk. Nothing was hurried. They did not need it to be. And when, one quiet morning, Della pressed his hand to her belly and whispered the news he hadn't dared to hope for, he wrapped his arms around her and held her long, his breath catching in the stillness. "You've given me everything," he said. She smiled against his chest. "No, Judson. Just what was always waiting to be found." They stayed together through every season that followed, through late harvests and early frosts, through the cry of their first child and the hush of winter nights. The land held them, steady and sure, and the cabin never stood empty again. Their love, like the creek that wound below the hill, ran quiet but deep, shaped by time and softened by care. And for the rest of their days, they remained just as they were that snowy morning, two people who had lost much, but found each other when it mattered most.